The Taliban special forces units stormed the airport and celebrated the U.S. withdrawal. Here you can see them right there decked out in American military outfits and weaponry. Speaking to the media, a Taliban spokesman said that, quote, America was defeated and Afghanistan is now a, quote, free and sovereign nation. Overall, 123,000 people were evacuated to the U.S. and 15,000 to the U.K. Also, tens of thousands of refugees fled to other countries across the globe. And today, August 31st, the final U.S. flight as part of the evacuation effort departed Kabul airport, heralding an end to the 20-year coalition conflict. The war has cost trillions in dollars and almost 250,000 of lives that have been lost. The world now turns its attention to the Taliban, hoping that the social and developmental gains made in the past 20 years are not erased overnight. Last night, also, the UN Security Council met to adopt a resolution requiring the Taliban to do a few things. One of them being safeguard gains for women and children's rights, also ensure the country doesn't become a safe haven for terrorists, and also allow foreign humanitarian organizations to carry out work unimpeded. And as we mentioned in the intro, China and Russia abstained from the vote on this resolution. So a lot to get to this morning. And with us to discuss is Bloomberg Opinion's Bobby Ghosh in London, as well as Eltaf Najafzada, who has handled Bloomberg's Afghanistan coverage extensively. And he is joining us from New Delhi. Eltaf, let's just start with you. What exactly does the Taliban want now from America, now that we have officially left the country?
Yeah, the Taliban, they are seeking international recognition from international community, especially from the United Nations. And that's why they have sought assistance of the United States to help them seek international recognition. That's one thing. And the second thing is the Taliban's, they facing worse economy situation in the country, especially the financial issue, and they want money to run the government. That's a daunting challenges for the Taliban, because the US Fed, they have cut off $9.5 billion in reserves for Afghanistan's central bank, and that's why the Taliban want them to be released to the Taliban governments in the future. So that's the reason that they want international recognitions. They want to seek good relationship with the United States, with all the countries around the world, even with the close neighbors, with the immediate neighbors, China, Pakistan, Iran, those countries.
Bobby, I also want to get your take on this. We mentioned a few things that we heard the Taliban spokesman said. Also, we heard them say at the airport, the Islamic Emirate wants a good and diplomatic relationship with the Americans. I wonder what you make of sort of what we heard from the Taliban as the Americans were finally exiting the country.
Well, I'm much more skeptical. I'd like to see them act rather than speak. The actions so far have been cautious in parts of the country that they have been running for several years now. Their behavior has not been very conciliatory. It's been very much Taliban 1.0. They're promising upon arrival in Kabul that they will be a different kind of Taliban, but I am very skeptical about that. I think they certainly want international recognition, but they want it on their terms. They wanted international recognition the last time around too, when they had power, but they refused to do the things that the international community required them to do. This time around, the international community once again is making very clear what the terms are for recognition. We'll see if the Taliban, first and foremost, agree to those terms, and then we'll have to monitor very carefully to make sure that they keep up their end of the bargain. They do have a history of giving their word and then taking it back.
But we did hear Jen Psaki at the White House say that the U.S. has leverage to hold the Taliban accountable for what they believe. Do you believe that the international powers do have some leverage, as Eltaf mentioned about some of the money that the Taliban wants? Bobby, I'm curious, do you think international powers do have leverage to hold the Taliban accountable?
Well, they have some limited powers. It all boils down to whether or not the Taliban, how badly the Taliban wants that money, and whether or not they're willing to make those compromises. It is not entirely unlikely that the Taliban might just decide at the end of the day that they're not willing to make those concessions and decide that they will return Afghanistan to where it was 20 years ago when they were still running the country. At that time, they were essentially cut out from the international community. It's a more complex country now. It's a more complex economy now. Hopefully, the Taliban realizes that. But we can't really be sure. Their understanding of international finance is not very particularly sophisticated. They have announced a central bank governor who has very little actual experience in finance and seems mainly to have been in charge of extortion rackets in parts of the country where they were in charge. This does not fill me with a great deal of optimism. And I think the other thing to look out for is what ordinary Afghans are saying and doing. The fact that so many people, particularly the kinds of people that the Taliban would have needed to run their country, to run their economy, so many of those people are fleeing or want to flee, suggests to me that they don't trust the Taliban. If they don't, then I can't see why the international community should.
And Altaf, just speaking of the ordinary Afghanis who are there, what have you heard about daily life now that the Americans have exited for the most part? I mean, has it changed at all?
Well, the normalcy is getting back to Kabul city, actually, because after the withdrawal of the American forces, there has not been any attacks, any suicide bombing at Kabul city. And people, restaurants are opening, shops are reopening, economy is slowly opening in Kabul city. Well, people are not worried now about their security situations. They are worried about their economic situation because the economy is getting its worst shape in Afghanistan. The prices are increasing. The medicines prices are increasing. The foods are increasing because the imports have been halted for a while by the Taliban at the customs port in Afghanistan, causing prices to go higher. So that's the issue, daunting issue the people are facing too. I have not seen the Afghan people in Kabul that they have celebrated the withdrawal of the American forces. Though there are some Afghans who are still fearful of their life, of their future, because of the Taliban's takeover of the country. And those who are fearful are the previous government officials, or the civil rights activists, or the journalists, because those people were told by the Taliban to come for some kind of investigations. Their houses, their homes were knocked by the Taliban to search them, to grab them, to take them into their custodies for some sort of investigation. So that has created fears among those kind of people. But there are some other people that I have spoken to. They are not worried of the Taliban because they have not seen any good thing in the previous government if they compare the previous government with the current government of the Taliban. So those people are kind of impartial. I mean, see that they're careless people. What they want is just job, good economy in the country, and that's it.
And we also heard, I mean, we mentioned that China and Russia abstained from that UN resolution, but we did hear China say that they're hoping the international community actually helps with some of those things that you mentioned, Altaf. What is it that China and Russia are potentially seeing in potentially a relationship that they could have with Afghanistan? I want to get your take, and then Bobby, I'd like to ask you as well.
I think China is trying to expand its influence in Afghanistan after the US left the country. So that vacuum, the power vacuum, has been left now in Afghanistan, and someone from outside the country is trying to fill in that vacuum, that power vacuum. I mean, also we could say that influence in the country. Afghanistan, it has rich mineral resources. That's something could benefit China. And China has already got several contracts of mineral resources from the previous governments. And they try to expand, its business environment, its business opportunities in Afghanistan as well through the Taliban government. It's not only the Taliban, Afghanistan's mineral resources. There are other regional projects in billions of dollars, like the Tapi gas pipeline, also going through Afghanistan. Also, the China's Build and Road Initiative in order to expand its influence across the region. Russia, well, of course, Russia didn't want to see American forces stationed or based in Afghanistan for the past 20 years, for the past 2 decades. They have always opposed their presence in Afghanistan. And we have had reports saying that Russia were also helping, funding the Taliban, providing weapons to the Taliban to fight against American forces in order to push them out of Afghanistan finally. And that happened yesterday. All the American forces left the country. And Russia, China, they have had some kind of positive, good relationship with the Taliban in the past 2 decades. And now they're trying to build on that in order to expand its influence across the country through friendship with the Taliban, which was being called a terrorist group. Now they are being called by Russians and Chinese people as reasonable people to deal with.
And Bobby, is that how you read it as well? I mean, I think it's interesting that China and Russia abstained from this resolution. Curious to get your take.
Well, they clearly want to be in the Taliban's good books. They don't want to be seen as putting too much pressure on the Taliban. By abstaining, they can have their cake and eat it too. They did not veto the resolution, which they could have done. So by abstaining, they are basically nodding to the international community and winking at the Taliban. I think Altaf is exactly right. Both Russia and China do not want a vacuum in Afghanistan. Their interests in the country are primarily to do with security and geopolitics. They don't want Afghanistan to become once again, a hotbed of terrorist activities, because some of those terrorist activities would be directed at Russia and China just as much as it is directed to the West. The Chinese do have an interest in Afghan mineral resources, but I personally am skeptical about just how far they will go to get those resources, because the investments required to get those minerals out of the ground and then transport them out of the country, in a country that has so little infrastructure, will be huge amounts of money. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars. That's a very high risk for Chinese companies to take, and they tend not to want to take those kinds of risks. They may have a bigger appetite for risk-taking than Western companies or Western banks, but at the same time, they're not so reckless as to barge into a country with uncertain political future, uncertain security environment. As Altaf pointed out, they did have some investments in China before. With the previous government, they had a 30-year concession on a very large copper mine not far from Kabul, but they couldn't make that project work. They couldn't make it work despite the presence of international forces guaranteeing security, despite having a deal with the Taliban in which the Taliban promised they wouldn't attack that mine. If China couldn't make it work, then I think we should be skeptical about whether it can sort of invest the tens of billions of dollars that Afghanistan will need going into the future.
And Bobby, just in the last minute or so, we're going to hear from President Biden in a few hours. Do you see this potentially putting a stain on his legacy at all, or do you think it will be a combination of the former presidents who sort of started this whole process and the changes made during the different presidents? I'm curious sort of what you think that will be written in the history books now that the 20-year war has officially ended.
Well, the war hasn't really ended. The United States the White House might want us to think it has. If our enemies haven't stopped fighting, it hasn't ended. As the U.S. now wants to fight a different kind of war, the over-the-horizon kind of war, from a safe distance using drones and aircraft. But whether that will work, we'll have to see. It didn't work in the past when we tried to get al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan without sending in ground troops. I'm skeptical that it'll work going into the future. Whether or not it stains Biden's legacy, I suppose, will depend to a substantial degree about what happens in Afghanistan now that the United States has left, and whether there is any blowback, whether terrorist groups like the Islamic States, like al-Qaeda, are able to reestablish themselves there and then begin to attack the West and attack the United States. That'll decide whether or not it'll stain Biden's legacy. But it's important to remember that unlike, let's say, in Vietnam, when the United States left the country, this is a very different news environment and very different information environment. This is taking place live on Twitter. People are seeing every step of the American withdrawal, and they're seeing every step of how the Taliban reacts afterwards. This is rather different from one still picture of a helicopter taking off from the roof of the embassy in Saigon. This is a much more powerful series of images. And I'm not even getting into the disinformation campaign that America's enemies will use in order to remind people over and over again about the humiliation in Afghanistan. So yeah, I think this will live longer in memory than the Biden administration is counting on.